The thing I want to ask us today is that have you ever just felt stuck? I'm doing all the right things. I'm doing all the stuff I'm supposed to do. And nothing's changing and nothing's getting any better. And thankfully, that's there. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today is exactly that issue, right? Because that's something we all deal with, is that I'm doing everything as far as I can tell I'm supposed to be doing it, and nothing's changing. Right? So today as we continue with our series, when life does not go as planned, that's specifically what I want to talk about. Now, it's kind of funny because I had my year planned out, right? So for 4 weeks, I was going to do this series, and then the guys from Teen Challenge were going to come, and then we're going to go on to the book of James, and here we are. We've actually been off from the series longer than we were in it. Okay, so who wants to volunteer to do a review for me? Right, so just a quick reminder, we've only covered the first 2 parts, but remember that what we're doing in this series is looking at the life of a guy named Joseph. Now remember that this is not kind of the more famous Joseph, what I call Jesus' stepfather. Right? This is actually much further back in time. If Jesus is 2,000 years ago, or not if, but Jesus is 2,000 years ago, Joseph is kind of, and we're only rough idea, but about 2,000 more years back, about 4,000 years ago, several hundred years before the time of even Moses. So that's kind of how far back we're going. And as we've talked about, this is a very different world than we live in. It's a much more harsh world. It's a much more cruel world. Human life is not really valued very much. And if you remember that when we first met Joseph, he was very close with his father. In fact, his father kind of spoiled him. He was his father's favorite. And he had 10 older brothers. And his father made no secret of the fact that Joseph is my favorite. And Joseph kind of stepped into that a bit, right? He didn't work as much as the other brothers did. He was, got to spend more time with his dad. His dad gave him special gifts. There's that kind of fancy cloak that his father gave to him. And we know that Joseph also, I always call him a narc, right? That he would actually go look around at what his brothers were doing, and when they did things wrong, he would run back and tell his dad. Understandably, this created animosity between Joseph and the brothers. So how did the brothers deal with the negative emotions? Did they call a counselor and saying, I'm having a really hard time with this, how can I work through it? No, they capture him. They were going to kill him, but they decide the nice thing to do, I guess, is to sell him into slavery. So they do that. And so that was kind of what we talked about the first week. And so the second week, we talked about the fact that he was serving in the household of a very powerful Egyptian. So technically he's a slave of this guy named Potiphar. But one of the things that we found is that Joseph kind of seemed to, for lack of a better way to say it, he kind of accepted his situation. I'm sure he was not happy about it. I'm sure that he wishes he was back home. But ultimately, he recognized there were some things in his life he couldn't control. And he trusted God with those things. And he did the best he could with what he could control. And what's the one thing we can all control? Ourselves, theoretically, right? Theoretically, we can control ourselves. We can control our emotions. We can control our actions. We can control the approach we take to things. And so Joseph just got up every day and did the best job that he could. And as a result, as he starts out as a very low servant, he starts to move his way up, gets more responsibility, more authority. Within the context of, he's not really free, but he does get more freedom, the ability to move around the house, move around the property as he wants to. And so, even though it wasn't what he would hope for, it was improving. And so as his life was kind of improving, it seems like, well, I can keep doing this. I've done all the right things. So if I do all the right things, only good things happen for me, right? But how did the second week end? Gets thrown in prison for something he didn't do. He gets accused of doing something. He did not do it. And he gets thrown in prison. He had done everything just like he was supposed to at that point. Now, we talked about the first week that, the stress between him and his brothers, he did participate in that. But from what we have from the time he's in Potiphar's household, he's kind of doing everything right. And he gets thrown in prison. And do you remember when he gets thrown in prison, after losing the freedom he had as a slave, that was the good life. Now he's thrown in prison. How did the narrative describe Joseph's situation? But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Nothing's going like he wants it to. It is not a life he would choose. And it just got worse. And it says the Lord is with him. And that's the thing that I think it's important for us to remember, that our relationship with God is not conditional, right? It's not this, I do good things, God gives me good things. I do good things, God gives me good things. What did Jesus say? Your life will have tribulation. Life will be hard. But just because things are difficult doesn't mean that God isn't with us. So this week, as we pick up the story, Joseph is now in the prison. And he starts out as just kind of a lowly inmate. But again, he approaches things as he did in Potiphar's household. He does the best he could with each day. And the narrative tells us that as he's in prison, it says this: the Lord showed Joseph kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And what's interesting here is that even though this is not a situation he would choose, good things are happening, right? That the warden could make his life really difficult if he wants to, but the warden does take a positive attitude towards Joseph. And because Joseph approaches things in the prison as he did in Potiphar's household as a servant, the same sort of things start happening. He does a good job. He has a positive attitude, as far as we can tell. And he starts to move up, and he starts to get more responsibility. And he starts caring for the other inmates. And within the context of his situation, he's still in prison, but he has more freedom. He has the ability to move around. He has the ability to interact with others. In fact, he does such a good job. The narrative says this: the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And this is something I think that's really important for us to kind of, we could easily read past, but it's important to kind of stop and notice. Even though this is not a situation that he would choose at all, and there's no aspect of it as a whole that seems good, there are still good things happening. Right? That when we're in our darkest times, when we've been sick for a long time, when we have relationship issues that are really hard, when we're struggling with money or a job, it can seem like everything is just bad. But that's a pretty rare circumstance. In pretty much every situation, there are good things to be found. But how do you find good things? If you lost your eyeglasses, how would you find them? You'd look for them. You may have to pat around in the dark, but you'd look for them. You want to find good things? You know what you have to do? Look for them. Right? Because if all we look for is the bad, what are we going to find? The bad. If we look for the good, we can find the good. I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, sometimes it's really hard. But honestly, even the effort of trying to find the good lifts our days up a bit. And you know what? It seems that from Joseph, as we'll read along, it seems that Joseph even finds a sense of, I kind of use this word very carefully, a sense of joy. Now, he's not joyful about the circumstance, but as he's finding good things, as he's having interactions with other people, as he's making a difference in other people's life, what does he have? He has purpose. He has meaning. He's doing constructive things. And he finds purpose and joy. He finds the good things. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to look for the good is first, there's just kind of the simple fact that when we look for good things, we find those things, we start to feel better. But there's also something important about the source of good things. If you go forward a couple thousand years to the first century, the New Testament author James tells us this about good things. James says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. What is James saying? Every good thing comes from God. So every time we find a good thing, it's a reminder of God's presence. That when we can feel so alone and so abandoned, the simple effort of doing two things: looking for the good, and when you find it, reminding ourselves that all good things come from God. That in our difficulties, we start to see the presence of God. We start to realize we are not alone. And notice that James says that God never changes. So that means that if in Joseph's life 4,000 years ago, if the good things were evidence of God's presence, today, God is unchanging. Good things are the evidence of God's presence. And it was that kind of attitude that continued to carry Joseph through what he was dealing with. And here's the thing we find. If Joseph gets up every day and makes the best of that day he can, finding good where he can, being reminded that God is with him even in this unpleasant situation, as he goes through his day, he ends up having a pretty good day. And he gets up tomorrow, and he does the same thing. He looks for the good, does the good that he can, makes a difference where he can, finds purpose where he can. He ends up having a pretty good day. He does it the next day. What does he have? Pretty good day. What's a good life? A series of good days. Right? If we will take it a day at a time, make the best of the day that we can, and do it again tomorrow, it's not always easy. In fact, it's often really hard. But if we string enough good days together, we're building a good life. Right? How often do we get ourselves all spun up because we're looking at this great big thing that we can't control, and it's all wrong, and it's all bad, I'm never going to get through it. But if we just get up today and address what we can and do the best we can with today and just do it again tomorrow, before long, we're building a good life, even when it's not the kind of life that we thought we would have, even when the experiences aren't what we had wished for, that we can still find good things and a good life, even when things are really, really hard. And so Joseph does that. And part of what he does is he begins to care much more about people. And what he doesn't realize is that his willingness to approach his life this way actually positions him for opportunities coming down the road later that he could never even imagine. Now, one of the things that happens while Joseph is in jail, and in prison. He's been in prison for quite some time. And during his time there, two kind of really special inmates come in. They're two high-ranking servants of the Pharaoh. Okay, remember, the Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. And two of his high-ranking servants, and they don't sound like it to us, but they are. One is a guy called the chief cupbearer. What does a cupbearer do? He bears the cup, right? But what he does is he gives the king his wine. But why is that an important position? If you want to get rid of the king, you poison the wine. Right? So he is trusted. Right? So he has that responsibility. So the Pharaoh gets mad at his chief cupbearer. He also gets mad at his baker. Now, I love bakers. But the Pharaoh really cares about his baker because what can the baker do? Poison his food. So these are two deeply trusted people. And we don't know why the Pharaoh gets so upset, but he gets so upset he throws them in jail. And we're told that when they get to the prison, the captain of the guard assigned them, the cupbearer and the baker, to Joseph. And it says that Joseph attended to them. Now, one of the things that we always want to remember, and I try to point this out often, is that the Bible was not written in English. Right? So every time we read it, we have to understand that it's coming from a different source language than we're reading. And so sometimes the particular words that a given translator uses doesn't always capture all the meaning. It's not that it's incorrect. It just doesn't fully capture the meaning. And at this point, we're talking about an old document like this. It was written in ancient Hebrew. And what's interesting is the word that's translated in this particular Bible translation as attended them can also be translated as ministered to them or cared for them. And there's a big difference in those phrases, right? Because attended to was like, oh, you're here, check. Right? But ministered to is you're there with them, you're supporting them, cared for them, right? Actually attended to their needs, did what needed to be doing. And what we find is that that's the kind of person that Joseph has become. Joseph, who was so spoiled and so self-focused when we first met him, is now becoming someone who, even though he doesn't have to treat these guys well, does. And he actually cares for them. In fact, other Bible translations actually do say he cares for them. And what shows us that Joseph is actually growing as a person. Can you imagine growing as a person throughout your life? How odd would that be, right? Right? But we grow as a person if we're willing to engage with it. And that's what's happening in Joseph's life, that he's actually becoming a more compassionate person. Now, we don't know how long these two guys spend in prison, but it appears to be a long time because the narrative says, and they had been in custody for some time. See how I did that? Right? I just told you what I was going to say. Look at that, right? But they had been in custody for some time. And it said that each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. So they had a dream, and they believe this dream has meaning, and they have their own distinct dreams. Now, the next morning comes along, and we start to see the kind of difference in Joseph. That as Joseph comes along, he notices that these two men seem to be kind of agitated, kind of upset. And so without them even telling him, he notices that something's up. And again, that shows us that he's becoming more compassionate. So he just notices that and says, hey guys, why are you so upset? And they say, well, we both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them. So what they're saying is that they believe these dreams are significant and that there is actually something important from these dreams that they need to understand. Now, it's interesting that they tell this to Joseph because Joseph feels the same way. In fact, it was Joseph's dreams who got him in trouble in our first part, right? That he dreamed that God was kind of painting a picture of something in the future that would happen to him. So Joseph offers to help. He's kind of like, I believe that God speaks to us sometimes through dreams. So he says that, what I can do is that, how do we interpret this? Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. In other words, I believe the same thing. Tell me your dream, and let's see if God will actually give us some insight into what's going on. And so they each describe their dreams. Now, the first dream, the cupbearer's dream, it's not too hard to figure out, I think. The cupbearer says that, okay, in my dream, I saw a vine. That vine had 3 branches, and very rapidly, those 3 branches produced buds, then blooms, and then finally had bunches of grapes on them. And I was holding Pharaoh's cup, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them in the cup, and then I handed the cup to Pharaoh. And so Joseph says, what that means is that within 3 days, Pharaoh will call for you and restore you to your position. You'll get your job back. The gig will come back. So that's great news for the cupbearer, right? So the baker hears this and is like, oh, do me next, mine too, right? So the baker tells his dream, and it's a little more subtle. The baker says that in my dream, I had 3 baskets of breads on my head, and I had baked all these goods for the king, for the Pharaoh. And they were stacked in the basket, and the very best items were in the very top basket. But then there were these birds, and the birds were actually eating the breads from the bottommost basket, the one closest to my head. And Joseph goes, the 3 baskets, that means he's going to call for you, the Pharaoh's going to call for you in 3 days and kill you, execute you, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. So not as good of a dream, right? So what's interesting is that Joseph basically says it's going to turn out good for one of you, you're going to go back. It's not going to turn out as good for the other of you. But now keep in mind that Joseph has actually built a relationship with these men. He has been caring for them. And so he says to the cupbearer that when you are restored to your position, well, you'll be in the presence of Pharaoh. That's kind of your job. When you get there, would you tell him about me? And Joseph goes on to say that I was taken from my family. I was sold into slavery. I was thrown into this prison for a crime I didn't commit. If you would tell Pharaoh about me, Pharaoh could actually release me from here, and I I could finally be free. If you will just remember me when you're with Pharaoh, I can be free. So 3 days go by, and things go just like Joseph interpreted the dreams to mean. That both of the men are called back, the cupbearer is restored to his position, and the baker is executed. And remember what Joseph's request to the cupbearer was. When you're before the Pharaoh, please remember me. And it says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And imagine how disappointed Joseph was, thinking that, I took care of these guys. I did what was right for them. I've done what's right each day. All I asked him to do was talk to his boss, right? Talk to the Pharaoh for me. And he let him down. And that's just a reality, right? In our lives, people let us down. And things don't go the way we want them to go. And we wish things would go differently. And there are people that we hope for coming through to help us, and they don't. And there are people we invest in that we think are going to actually, do what we need them to do, and they don't. But that doesn't mean that God's not with us. That doesn't mean the things will always be bad, but people will let us down. So for Joseph, what's he going to do? He's going to keep doing what he's been doing. He just gets up every day. He does the best job that he can. And this is where things start to turn. That so often we think we have to control everything. We think that if I can't control everything, it's never going to work out. But keep in mind, what did Joseph control? The thing that he could. He made sure he did a good job every day. He made sure he was caring towards people. He served people as best he could. He did all those things with no idea how it would ever pay off. But one day, something completely outside of his control happens that creates opportunity for him. Because now that the cupbearer is back serving in the house of Pharaoh, and a bunch of time has gone by. Joseph has spent years in the prison, and even years beyond when the cupbearer was there. And he carries on. But then one day, the Pharaoh has a pair of dreams. And these are kind of strange dreams. And we all have strange dreams sometimes. Thankfully, I've never had these dreams. But in one of the dreams, he dreams of, again, this is the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh dreams that there are 7 healthy, well-fed cattle. And then coming up out of a river becomes 7 very sickly, underfed, emaciated cattle. And in the dream, the emaciated cattle approach the healthy cattle and consume them, and they're gone. As you might expect, Pharaoh wakes up a bit disturbed by that dream. And he has another dream. In his other dream, there are 7 bunches of very rich, healthy grain. And then there are 7 bunches of very sickly, burnt out, horrible, dried out looking grain. And the sickly grain consumes the healthy grain, and it's gone. And so Pharaoh awakes very disturbed, believing that these dreams are pointing him towards something. And so he has people around his house that he believes interprets dreams. So he goes around asking all the people he has access to, I want to know what this dream means. Who can interpret this dream for me? And no one can. And the Pharaoh's not happy. Well, if you work in Pharaoh's house and Pharaoh's not happy, who else is happy? Nobody. So suddenly, that jars the cupbearer's memory. Oh, wait a minute. I know a guy that can get me out of this pain. Right? So he actually goes to the Pharaoh, and he tells the Pharaoh that, remember back a few years ago when you got really upset one day and you sent me and the baker off to the prison? Well, while we were there, me and the baker each had dreams, and this guy named Joseph interpreted them, and his interpretations came out exactly like he said. So with that information, it tells us that Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when Joseph had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And I think about that. Now, in this case, we're describing what actually happened for Joseph. He was brought from the dungeon. But when you've been in a long, hard, dark period of your life, and it finally breaks and you finally get to the other side, doesn't it kind of feel like you've finally been pulled out of the dungeon? But the difference here is that for Joseph, all he had to do was, shave, shower, and change his clothes, and he was free and cleaned up. The reality for us oftentimes is that when we're in a long, dark road that carries on, and we get to the other side, somehow a shave, shower, and changing our clothes doesn't make us feel better. And that's one of the big challenges I think we face in our lives, that when we have really long difficulties, even when things get better, sometimes we get a moment of glee, but then somehow the weight of it still sticks with us. And it takes time to get through it. And the thing that I would encourage us all with is that if you're experiencing something like that, and you're like, things are better, why don't I feel better? Give yourself a break. It's hard, right? We're complicated emotional bags of water, right? And then sometimes it just, when we get upset and things happen, it just takes us time to get through them. So give yourself time. A shower and a shave may not get it done. You may need counseling. You may need time. You just may need a chance to process it. That we feel like we've gotten out of a dungeon, but somehow it feels like the dungeon's still on us a little bit. But now for Joseph appears before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks Joseph to interpret his dream. And basically, Joseph says, I can't do it. Now, that's not what Pharaoh wants to hear. But he says, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And this is something that when I read that particular verse, it reminds me of situations where I'm tempted to misrepresent myself. That, I'm in some difficult situation. Maybe I didn't like a job I had, or I wanted to get a better job, or I want to do something else. And someone asked me about something, and I'm like, well, God wants good things for me. So if God wants good things for me, if I fib a little bit about something I actually did to make myself look better, that's okay, because God wants good things for me. Right? So lying to make things easier for God, that's okay, right? That's not okay. Just, that's not okay. Right? That Joseph could have walked into this situation going, yes, I'm your man. I will take care of that dream for you. That's not what he did. He walked up with humility. He says, I'm not the one who does this. God does this. In other words, he didn't try to take control of a situation that was not his to control. Right? God is bringing this together, so he's going to enter into it honestly. So he says, I'm not the one who does this, but if God wants to reveal this, he'll reveal it. So the Pharaoh tells Joseph the dream. And Joseph says, what that dream means is that you're about to head for a very difficult period of time. That for 7 years, you're going to have great plenty. There's going to be lots of prosperity, lots of food, everything's going to be wonderful. But then that's just going to end, and it's going to suddenly end. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine. Now, that's kind of bad news. And generally, you don't like to tell big, powerful, monarchs bad news, because what's the term we use for that when they're not happy? They kill the messenger. But Joseph wasn't worried about that. Joseph says, this is what it says. This is the answer. And then Joseph goes on from there. And he says that what you need to do is this. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. So now he's given the Pharaoh bad news. He's giving him unsolicited advice. You don't do that. And then he goes into tremendous detail about what needs to happen. And he gives a very specific plan on how to manage the resources and what you need to do. And I could only imagine that all the people in the Pharaoh's court are just kind of stepping back a little bit, being really quiet, seeing what happens. Because this could go really either way, right? The Pharaoh could be really happy this has happened, or the Pharaoh could be like, nah, I don't like this guy, off with his head, sort of thing, right? And it tells us the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. Why did it seem good to his officials? Because it seemed good to Pharaoh. If it seemed bad to Pharaoh, they would have thought so too, right? So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God. And this gets back to something we looked at earlier in the series. That God actually gives us the opportunity to be his presence in other people's lives. Right, we've talked about that when we actually are caring for people, when we serve people, when we step out to do the good that we can. God's now allowing us to be his presence. right? That God could do it all without us. But he doesn't choose to do it that way. He chooses to do things through us. And so Joseph, over the time he has spent growing and becoming a very renewed person, a more compassionate person, he steps into the situation with integrity and honesty. And Pharaoh says, this guy brings the presence of God. And then Pharaoh does something that seems hard for us to imagine, but Pharaoh recognizes that this is a dire situation. No one else has presented a plan. This guy has presented a plan. So he says, let's put Joseph in charge of the whole thing. And in fact, the way the narrative tells us is that Pharaoh says, this is so important, you report directly to me. No one will use any resources anywhere around here without going through Joseph first. In fact, he tells Joseph, you are second in power only to me, the Pharaoh. Now that's really exciting, but have you ever been offered a job you can't do? I'm really happy, it's got a great paycheck, but I'm going to fail, right? Well, can Joseph do this job? Well, when we first met Joseph, no, he couldn't. He was selfish. He was self-entitled. He certainly didn't have the necessary skills to manage resources and people. And honestly, as far as we can tell, he didn't have the kind of care about people that would have been necessary to do this job well. But after his long time locked away, he has changed. Now, how long has Joseph been on his long journey? You know, the Christian phrase we use is that he was in the desert. You know, when you're in a long period of time where nothing's going the way you want. I was in a desert. Well, Joseph was in a desert. It just happened to be a dungeon and slavery, right? But how long was all that going on? Well, again, how old was Joseph when we met him? 17. It says Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph had spent 13 years, at that point almost half his life, in captivity, feeling lost, trapped, often feeling completely forgotten. But what did he do? He got up every day and he did what he could with that day, making it the best day he possibly could. Right? That I'm sure to him it seemed like this was going to go on forever. It was never going to end. But each day, he grew. Right? Each day he did the good that he could do. Each day he had the best attitude he could have. He served people. He cared for people. He grew to become compassionate. And in that time, he learned abilities and skills that enabled him to do a better job when opportunity came along. And the thing is, as I wrap up here, is that the thing that I want us to see, or as I'm hoping we'll see, is that what we read in Joseph's life is not just the solution for what Joseph was dealing with. Right? This is a model that we can all apply in our lives, right? That all of us, when we're dealing with challenges, we can just do what Joseph did. And I'm not saying, it's simple but not easy. Right? In other words, it's not complicated, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. Right? What did Joseph do? He leaned on God. And what we found is in leaning on God, he actually grew closer to God. And God stopped being a distant idea and became a personal relationship. And he grew in that. And then he served people and he cared for people and he became more compassionate. And he started valuing other people above himself. What did he do? He became more Christ-like. Or even though he didn't know who Christ was. But he followed that path, and that's the path for us. That if we can become more Christ-like, it can transform our lives. So that even as we're in that difficult situation, when we finally get to the other side of it, if we will retain those things, if we will grow in that time, which is a great opportunity to grow, and I don't mean great as in good, but a tremendous opportunity to grow and we're in our difficulties. If we carry those traits with us to the other side, we can live out our lives more Christ-like, more satisfying, more meaningful. But these things that we're talking about aren't just about getting to the other side. Right? The reality is that sometimes in our lives, we have difficult times, and we never get to the other side. Not in this life. Right? Sometimes we stay sick. Sometimes we continue to have struggles in our relationships. Because the thing is that in order to kind of really embrace this kind of transformation that was happening in Joseph's life, the goal can't be to get to the other side. I'll just keep doing this until I get to the other side. No, Joseph just kept doing it. And in the midst of the difficulty, he grew. And I think that's for all of us, is that if we will simply focus on that making the best of the time we're in. Don't wish away the time, even when things are hard. Just make the best of them and embrace it. And in that, we're transformed. But now, what about Joseph? He did reach the other side. And he is facing a huge challenge, caring for all these resources. What's he going to do? When are we going to know? Next week, when we wrap up our series on when life does not go as planned.